Hi everyone, welcome back to Think and Speak English. I'm Adam, and it's really good to have you here with us today.
And I'm Julia. This is episode 14, and we are now well into our C1 series. And I have to say, this particular episode is one that I've been looking forward to for a while.
Me too, actually, because today we're talking about something that I think sits at the heart of everything we do when we communicate in any language. We're talking about storytelling, specifically how to tell stories in English in a way that feels emotionally real, that draws people in, that makes them feel something.
And not in a theatrical way. Not in a way that requires you to perform or exaggerate or be someone you're not, but in a quiet, considered way. The kind of storytelling that happens in everyday conversation when you're sharing something that genuinely mattered to you.
Which is actually much harder to do well than dramatic storytelling, because it requires you to be precise, to choose the right detail, to let the emotion sit in the words rather than forcing it through your voice.
And in English specifically, there's a particular quality to good emotional storytelling that I think is worth understanding. It tends to be understated. It trusts the listener to feel what the story is pointing toward, rather than telling them how to feel.
Right. You don't say, "It was the most devastating moment of my life." You describe the moment itself, and you let the listener arrive at that feeling on their own.
Which is actually more powerful, because then the feeling belongs to the listener. They made it themselves.
Let's just start by talking about stories. Not teaching anything yet, just talking. Julia, what's a story that you remember being told as a child? Something that has stayed with you?
Oh, that's a nice question to start with. Let me think. There's one, actually. My grandmother used to tell a story about the day she arrived in a new city as a young woman. She was in her early 20s. She didn't know anyone. And she arrived at the train station with one suitcase and, as she always said, not enough money and too much hope.
Oh, I love that phrase.
Right? And what I remember is not the events of the story particularly. It was more the way she told it. She was very calm. She never made it dramatic. She would just say, "I remember sitting on a bench in the station, and I didn't know which direction to walk. And I sat there for quite a long time." And then she'd pause. And that pause felt like everything.
Because in that pause, you filled it in yourself. You imagined what it felt like to be that young woman on the bench.
Exactly. And looking back, I think that pause was one of the most skilled things she did as a storyteller. She gave you space to be inside the story with her.
That's such a beautiful example, and it points to something really important about emotional storytelling. It's not about filling every moment with feeling. Sometimes it's about leaving room.
Room for the listener to do their own feeling.
Right. And that's something that takes a certain confidence, because when you leave a pause, when you slow down, it can feel like you're losing people, like the story is losing momentum.
But often the opposite is true. The pause draws people in. It signals that something important just happened, or is about to happen.
Let me share one of my own. Something small, but it stayed with me. A few years ago, I was working late one night in an office building, and everyone else had gone home. And I remember standing in the kitchen making a cup of tea and looking out at the city through the window. It was raining, and I had this very clear thought. I can't even explain why it arrived then, but I thought, I don't want to still be here in 5 years.
Meaning in that job?
Meaning in that life. That particular version of my life. And what stood out to me wasn't the thought itself necessarily. It was how quiet it was, how matter of fact. It wasn't a crisis. It wasn't panic. It was just a very still, clear recognition.
And did things change after that?
Slowly, yes, but not immediately. I finished my tea. I went back to my desk. I worked for another couple of hours, but something had shifted, and I knew it had.
And see, the way you just told that story. There was no dramatic music, no big emotional declaration. You described the rain, the tea, the quiet, and the feeling came through all of that.
Which I think is what good storytelling in English often looks like. You build the scene carefully. You let the ordinary details carry the weight.
And those details are important, not just any details, the right details, the ones that create atmosphere, the ones that put the listener in the room with you.
How do you choose which details to include? Because that feels like one of the harder skills. You could describe everything, but you don't want to describe everything.
I think the details that earn their place in a story are the ones that carry double meaning. They describe the physical world and something emotional at the same time. So, it was raining isn't just weather. In the context of your story, the rain added to a sense of stillness, of being alone, of the world being quiet outside, while you had this quiet thought inside.
So the rain was doing emotional work in the story, not just descriptive work.
Exactly, and once you start thinking about it that way, you become more selective. You ask yourself, is this detail just describing the scene, or is it also telling us something about how the moment felt?
I love that question. It's such a useful filter.
Let's talk about pacing, because I think pacing is one of the things that separates a story that feels engaging from one that feels either rushed or on the other extreme, like it never quite gets anywhere.
Right, and both of those things can happen to very fluent speakers. It's not just a language issue, it's a storytelling issue.
When you rush a story, you skip the details that create atmosphere. You get to the point quickly, but the listener hasn't had time to settle into the world of the story. So the ending, even if it's significant, doesn't land with its full weight.
And when you go too slowly or include too much, the listener starts to lose the thread. They're waiting for the story to get somewhere, and it keeps stopping to describe things that don't quite feel relevant.
So pacing is really about trust, trusting the listener to follow you, and trusting yourself to know when you've given them enough.
And I think it helps to think about stories as having a kind of breath. There are moments where you move forward, where events happen, and there are moments where you breathe, where you reflect or describe or pause, and a well-paced story alternates between those two things.
That's a really nice way to think about it. The story breathes.
Let's try something. Julia, can you tell me a story? Something recent, something personal. Doesn't need to be dramatic. Just something that happened and that stayed with you for some reason.
Okay, let me think. Something recent. Right. So this happened maybe 3 weeks ago. I was on the tube, the underground, and it was a fairly ordinary Tuesday morning, quite busy, and I was standing, holding the overhead bar, reading something on my phone. Very unremarkable situation.
Sure.
And at one of the stops, an older man got on. He was probably in his late 70s, and he sat down across from me. And he had a very small paper bag on his lap, one of those white paper bags you get from a bakery, and he opened it very carefully and took out a croissant. And he held it for a moment, just looking at it, not eating it, just looking. And then he looked up and he caught me watching him. And I felt embarrassed immediately, like I'd been caught staring. But he just smiled, very slightly, and then he looked back down at his croissant. And I remember thinking, I wonder where he's going or coming from. I wonder what that croissant means to him this morning.
That's a beautiful small story, and what I noticed is that you never told me how you felt. Not directly, but I felt something listening to it.
And I think the reason is because I tried to describe what I actually saw rather than how I interpreted it. The bag, the careful way he opened it, the pause before he ate. Those small, specific physical details.
And then the question at the end. I wonder what that croissant means to him this morning. That's the reflection. That's the moment where you, as the storyteller, step slightly outside the scene and look at it from a distance.
And I think that reflection is such an important part of emotional storytelling. Not over-explaining. Not saying, and this made me feel the smallness and beauty of ordinary life. Just asking the question and leaving it open.
Because the open question does more work than the answer would.
It does. It invites the listener to sit in that uncertainty with you.
I want to talk about emotional shifts within a story, because one of the things that makes stories feel real is that emotions don't stay constant. They move. They change. Sometimes mid-sentence.
Right. A story that has only one emotional note, only sad, or only funny, or only tense, feels a bit flat after a while. Real experience is more layered than that.
And managing those shifts in English without it feeling jarring is a real skill, because you have to signal to the listener that the emotional temperature is changing. But do it smoothly, not abruptly.
And there are phrases that help with that. Things like, but then something shifted, or, and then strangely, or, which I didn't expect, or, looking back, it's almost funny now. But at the time.
Right. At the time, it felt, is such a useful phrase, because it creates distance between the emotion in the story and the emotion of the person telling it now. And that distance is what allows you to talk about difficult things without it feeling like you're still in the middle of them.
And that distance also builds trust with the listener. When someone tells a story and they're still visibly overwhelmed by it, it can be hard to know how to receive it. But when someone tells a story from a place of reflection, you feel held. You feel like they've processed it enough to share it clearly.
So the emotional distance, the looking back perspective, it's not coldness, it's generosity. It makes the story easier to receive.
Let me try to show what I mean. Let me tell a short story, and I'll try to move through a couple of different emotional registers.
Go ahead.
Okay. So, a few years ago, I had to give a presentation to a fairly large group of people, about 70 or 80. And I had prepared quite thoroughly. I thought I was ready, but about an hour before I was supposed to go on, I found out that one of the main pieces of data I'd built part of my argument around was incorrect. Someone had sent me a wrong figure and I hadn't double-checked it.
Oh, that feeling.
Yes, and at the time, it felt genuinely catastrophic. I remember standing in a corridor, just staring at my phone, rereading the email, hoping I'd misunderstood it. I had about 50 minutes to either fix it or reconfigure the whole section.
What did you do?
I just started working. I went into a sort of quiet, focused state that I actually don't fully understand even now. Because 30 minutes earlier, I'd been quite nervous, and then suddenly the nervousness just disappeared. And I was just solving a problem.
That's interesting. The crisis actually helped.
Which I didn't realize until afterward. At the time, I was just doing whatever needed doing. But looking back, I think the concrete problem to fix was actually easier to manage than the abstract anxiety I'd been feeling before. And in the end, I went on. I acknowledged to the audience that I'd had to make a late adjustment to one section. And the presentation went well.
And now? How does it feel when you tell it?
Now it's almost a source of confidence, actually, because what I didn't know then, but I know now, is that I can manage something like that, and that's worth quite a lot.
And that story just moved through 3 distinct emotional states. The panic, the strange calm, and then the retrospective confidence. And each one felt natural. Each one earned its place.
And I tried not to overplay any of them. The panic was real, but I didn't dwell in it. The calm was surprising, but I didn't explain it too much. And the confidence at the end is quiet. It's not triumphant.
Because triumphant would have felt like too much. Like you were telling the story to prove something.
Whereas this way, you're just sharing something and letting the listener draw their own conclusions.
Let's talk about connecting with the listener. Because emotional storytelling is ultimately about connection. You're not performing for an audience. You're sharing something with another person.
And I think what creates that connection is a sense that the storyteller is present. That they're not on autopilot, reciting something they've told 100 times. That there's still something genuine in the telling.
And in conversation, that comes partly from responding to the listener. Noticing when they react, pausing when you sense they need a moment, adjusting if they seem lost.
Which is why storytelling in conversation is different from storytelling in writing or in a formal speech. It's responsive, it's alive, in a way that prepared text can never be.
And for language learners, one thing that can help a lot is to start small. Not to try to tell a big, complex emotional story right away, but to practice with small, specific moments. The croissant story, the tea in the office kitchen. Those are small stories, but they're genuinely felt.
And small stories are actually harder to tell well than big ones. Because with the big story, the drama carries the weight. The events themselves are interesting. But with a small story, the craft has to do more work. The detail, the pacing, the reflection, those things carry everything.
So practicing with small stories is actually one of the best ways to develop your storytelling skills in English.
Let me ask you something, Adam. When you're listening to someone tell a story, what makes you feel most connected to them? What makes you lean in?
That's a good question. I think honesty about uncertainty. When someone is telling a story and they say, "And I'm still not sure how I feel about this," or, "Even now, I can't completely explain why I reacted that way." That kind of admission pulls me in, because it means they haven't tidied the story up too much. There's still something unresolved in it.
And that unresolvedness is actually where the most interesting emotional territory is.
Right. The stories we've fully understood and processed and packaged neatly tend to be less compelling than the ones where there's still a question inside them.
So, leaving some things unresolved in a story is not a weakness. It's not incomplete storytelling. It can be the most authentic thing you do.
And in English, there are phrases that hold that unresolvedness well. "I'm still not entirely sure why." Or, "There was a moment when I didn't know what to feel." Or, "I've thought about this a lot, and I still don't have a clear answer."
Those phrases give the listener permission to sit with you in the not knowing, rather than waiting for the tidy conclusion.
Let's do a storytelling role play. I'll tell a slightly longer story, and Julia, I want you to respond the way you would in a natural conversation. Ask questions when you're curious. Respond when something resonates. let's see how the story changes shape in a real exchange.
I love that.
Okay, so this is something that happened when I was probably 24, 25. I was living abroad for the first time. A different country, different language, different culture, and I'd been there for about 6 months.
Was this for work?
Partly for the experience. I'd wanted to live somewhere very different, and in many ways it was everything I'd hoped it would be. It was interesting. It was challenging. I was learning a lot. But there was a loneliness to it that I hadn't quite anticipated.
That kind of loneliness is hard to describe to people who haven't felt it, because from the outside, you're having this adventure.
Exactly. And I felt like I couldn't quite say how I was feeling. Because every time I talked to people at home, they'd say, "Oh, how wonderful you must be having the time of your life." And I'd say, "Yes, it's incredible." Because some of it genuinely was. But I was also very lonely. And those two things were both completely true at the same time.
Holding those two things together is actually quite difficult.
It is. And there was a specific evening. I remember it was a Sunday. And Sundays are hard when you're alone in a foreign country. Everything feels slightly quieter and more still. And I was in a small cafe near where I lived. And I was eating dinner alone, and I was reading a book or pretending to read a book. And a family sat down at the table next to me. Parents, 2 children, maybe a grandmother. And they were just having dinner, talking, laughing, passing food across the table.
And you were watching.
I was. And what I remember most clearly is not feeling sorry for myself, which I half expected to feel. What I actually felt was something closer to gratitude, that this ordinary family moment was happening right next to me, and I got to be near it, even if I wasn't part of it.
That's such an unexpected turn.
And I didn't quite understand it at the time. Looking back, I think there was something about being very far from home that made ordinary domestic warmth feel extraordinary. But in the moment, I just sat there, and I watched them, and I felt okay.
And did things get easier after that?
Slowly, the loneliness didn't disappear, but I think that Sunday evening changed something in how I held it. I stopped waiting for the loneliness to end, and I started finding small things to be present for, even if they weren't mine. Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense, and there's something really mature in that shift. From waiting for things to be different to finding something in things as they are.
And I didn't arrive at that through any kind of deliberate thought. It happened in a cafe on a Sunday evening, watching a family eat dinner.
Which is how most genuine shifts happen. Not through decisions, through moments.
Exactly.
And see, what happened in that story conversation? There were moments where I asked questions, and those questions actually changed the direction of the story slightly. The story found more of itself in the exchange.
Right. I don't know if I would have said the same things if you hadn't asked about the loneliness, or responded to the unexpected turn. The conversation shaped the telling.
Which is why storytelling in conversation is such a particular and beautiful skill. It's co-created, in a sense. The listener is part of it.
And for learners, this is really freeing, because it means you don't need to have your story fully formed before you start. You can let the conversation help you find it.
Let's talk about the cultural dimension for a moment, because there's something worth saying about how emotional storytelling works in English, particularly in terms of the balance between emotion and restraint.
Yes, because this balance is quite specific, and it's quite different from some other storytelling traditions.
In a lot of English language storytelling cultures, especially in professional or semi-professional contexts, there's a strong value placed on composure, on being able to share something emotionally significant while maintaining a kind of steadiness.
Which doesn't mean suppressing emotion. It means containing it enough that the story remains clear. remains accessible, remains something the listener can follow without feeling overwhelmed.
And I think for learners who come from cultures where more expressive emotional storytelling is the norm, this can feel like being asked to be less authentic, like you're toning yourself down.
But I don't think that's quite right. I think it's more that the emotion in English storytelling often lives in a different place. It lives in the specific detail, in the well-chosen word, in the pause, rather than in the volume or the expressiveness of the telling.
And once you start looking for emotion in those quieter places, you start to find it everywhere. In the way someone describes a croissant being held. In the word pretending, when someone says they were pretending to read a book.
Yes, pretending to read a book. That did a lot of work in the story, didn't it? Because it told us immediately that the reading wasn't really about reading. It was about having somewhere to look.
A small, honest admission, and it cost nothing. But it opened the whole scene up.
That's the precision that good emotional storytelling requires. Finding the word or phrase that opens things up.
No to read off, duty. And for learners at C1 level, you have access to enough vocabulary to make those choices. The question now is not whether you have the words. It's whether you're making conscious, deliberate decisions about which words to use.
Choosing with intention, rather than just reaching for the first available phrase.
Which takes practice, and takes a willingness to revise. To tell a story and then think afterward. Was that the right detail? Did that word do what I wanted it to do?
And over time, that reflection changes how you tell stories. You develop a kind of instinct for it.
Let's take things toward the end gently. I want to just reflect for a moment on what we've been doing today.
Yes, let's.
We told stories, we've listened to stories, we've talked about what makes a story land emotionally without feeling forced. And I think what runs through all of it is something quite simple. Presence.
Being genuinely there in the story you're telling, not performing it, just being in it.
And trusting the listener to meet you there, to do their own feeling, their own imagining, their own connecting.
And at C1 level, you have the language to do that. The question is whether you trust yourself to use it with that kind of intention.
Which is partly a language question and partly just a human question. Because even in our first language, most of us are still learning how to tell the stories that matter to us in ways that feel true.
That's a generous thing to say. And I think it's important for learners to hear. You are not behind. You are on the same journey as everyone else, just doing it in more than one language.
And that's actually remarkable. The fact that you can tell a story in English, even imperfectly, even with pauses and hesitations, even with the occasional search for a word. That's not a limitation. That's a very human thing.
And sometimes those pauses, those searches for the right word, those moments of, I'm not sure how to say this, those are actually moving in themselves, because they show that you care about getting it right, that the story matters to you.
And if the story matters to you, it will matter to the listener. That's almost always true.
In episode 15, we're going to look at something that connects closely to today. We're going to explore how to express nuanced opinions in English, the kind of views that aren't just, I agree or I disagree, but something more considered, something that holds complexity without losing clarity.
Because at C1 level, your thinking is sophisticated. And the goal now is to make sure your English is sophisticated enough to match it.
We're looking forward to that one. But for now, thank you for being here with us today. Thank you for listening to the stories. And we hope you found something in today's episode that stays with you.
Until next time, keep thinking, keep speaking, and keep telling the stories that matter to you. Because your stories are worth telling in any language.
Goodbye, everyone. This is Think and Speak English. Take care of yourselves.
Bye. See you in episode 15.